the life for the American slave was harsh. They were kept isolated within the plantation community. Slaves who misbehaved, if beating them and shackling them wasn't enough, they were often sold to plantations in Louisiana and Mississippi that were harsher towards the treatment of slaves. And that's where the phrase, sold down the river, comes from. Missouri was a free state and a slave state as a result of the Missouri Compromise.
It was on the Mississippi River, bordered on the east by Illinois, a free state, on the north by the Iowa Territory, on the west by Kansas, Nebraska, which was free, and then by Arkansas on the south.
The law in Missouri at the time was once free, always free. If a slave owner in Missouri took their slave to a free state and stayed there long enough to meet that state's basic residency requirements.
They had lived in a state that had forbidden the enslavement of human beings. The result being that they had become free and now could not have that free status removed from them. This was something that almost precipitated a civil war at the time. Thomas Jefferson, who was still alive, called it a fire bell in the night that awoke him to the danger that was facing the United States.
St. Louis in the mid-1800s was a boom town. It was fur trading on the river. It was a hustle and bustle of a really busy, young city.
People were coming into St. Louis from all over. It was a growing city. Eventually it would become the fastest growing city and the fourth largest city in the United States of America.
We were right at the center of transport up and down the Mississippi River and commerce moving through St. Louis out west. Slavery was a part of that boom. It was a cheap way for many businesses to participate in that boom.
Those who were enslaved were able to see the experience of freedom. They met enslaved blacks from the hinterland, but they also met free blacks who came through the river as workers on the steamboat trade that brought such new and different ideas into St. Louis.
There were free African Americans living here in St. Louis, right next to plantations that had slaves. As a result of that, you had people who were abolitionists and very much opposed to slavery, and of course those who were benefiting from slavery because they owned slaves. So this town, our city, was the epicenter of the conflict between slavery and freedom.
And this is the situation that we had in 1846 when Dred and Harriet Scott first came to the courthouse.
The Dred Scott case actually started with a trial here in our court here in the city of St. Louis.
Dred had argued that he had been removed from Missouri and had stood foot in a free state, and that was the predicate for him to be able to go to the courts and sue for his freedom.
And ultimately, their case landed in the U.S. Supreme Court in front of Justice Robert Taney, who was prepared to use Harriet and Dred Scott's freedom suit as a vehicle to eliminate all possible litigation by slaves of any kind, eliminating any possibility that a slave anywhere in America could ever sue for their freedom.
The outcome of the Dred Scott case was a watershed, because what it now meant was that the courthouse door had been slammed shut.
It was a horrible decision. And when you read the words that the justice wrote, it tended to raise the hair on the back of my neck.
That we were born with lower intelligence as a matter of our genetic predisposition. that we were ordained by God to be a subservient people to the white man, that the white man would become tainted by having any involvement with the black man beyond that of master-servant. For decades, for generations, everyone looked at the Dred Scott case, including lawyers learning about this in law school, as if it were a one-off, that it just happened one time. Until
in about 2005, there were all these documents that were discovered in the St. Louis County Courthouse. About 300 of them were freedom suits that were initiated by slaves who wanted to be free. 300 people made a way to do this before Dred Scott was able to do it, setting the way, if you will, for Dred Scott's suit to even go to the Supreme Court.
This city's history speaking to us through the legal files that have been stored away and long forgotten.
Documents, authentic documents, court records that not only give those stories life, but they depict in detail who those people were, what their arguments were, what their predicaments were.
But the records of their petitions are the story of their past. And they bring to life, in their own words, their experiences under slavery and their experiences as free individuals struggling against an unjust society, and their allies assisting them in this particular endeavor.
The lawyers fighting the freedom suits filed to fight for the civil rights of slaves to be free is very much like the rights that civil rights lawyers are fighting for today.
And these were men who stood up against this institutional slavery and made decisions that we were going to free these people, that this bondage was not right, it was not proper, and they did the right thing.
The freedom suits themselves provided slaves an opportunity to actually litigate their right to freedom.
They had to demonstrate to the court, and most significantly, to a jury of white property-holding males, that they were entitled to their freedom.
Once a slave established in court that they in fact had earned their freedom in another state, then the instruction from the judges to the jurors was that they had to issue a judgment in favor of the enslaved African American.
And in 40% of the cases, the petitioner won, which is a remarkable, remarkable outcome.
Now, of course, all of them didn't win. So if you can imagine, some of those slaves suffered tremendous amount of retribution and punishment for having the nerve and the dignity to stand up and say that they should be free.
When those dusty old files were closely looked at, it caught the attention of historians, of the Missouri Historical Society, of the public, and of all of us who are working to establish a memorial.
Judge Mason put out a request for proposals for artists to submit, and we had many submissions. The submission that Preston Jackson gave us was head and shoulders above the rest.
My work has centered around speaking out for others, unfortunates, because that's who I was. That's how I lived. That's what I saw. I speak for human beings. And as you can see in the background, we have the maquette here in my studio. The maquette is a model for the piece that will be scaled up, maybe some 19 feet for this.
This is a three-dimensional, dynamic visual narrative where a female slave is testifying. She's there in the courtroom, her lawyer is there, and the judge is there. And she's testifying to try to be free. Outside the courthouse, there's also a scene. And what Preston has rendered for us is the reality where slavery is still accepted.
One important part of this sculpture is that it is divided between two different societies, divided by light. Look through this magnificent, tall, lightning wedge shape. You can see a strong light coming through the piece toward the river.
Preston Jackson wants us to realize that, in fact, even though there is this ray of hope, this pathway that a slave could be free, the harsh reality was slavery was still very present in St. Louis and in the United States.
Anyone looking at this outstanding memorial will get a visual history lesson, a history lesson over facts or circumstances that they no doubt did not get in school.
And the struggles that so many people took to bring us to where we are today. And the struggle still goes on.
In cities all across this country, we've seen Civil War memorials torn down, memorials to things that were wrong in our nation's history, to slavery, to the Confederacy. However, the Freedom Suits Memorial is a memorial to the right side of history, a memorial to the courageous slaves, their lawyers, and the steadfast judges who made sure that the courts of our city had open doors.
How brave they must have been to take on the challenges of the court system at the time, having very little chance of success, but feeling that this was their pathway to freedom. That's worth memorializing, and I think it's worth doing in such a fashion as we'll have here on this plaza.
I'm so excited that St. Louis is going to have the Freedom Suits Memorial right here in front of the Civil Courts building. You know, not everyone knows the history of the Freedom Suits, and this memorial will bring this to life for the many kids and the older folks who come to visit this. Hopefully, they'll come away understanding the courage and the bravery that it took for the folks who filed the Freedom Suits.
The achievement of these individuals or their frustrated efforts really must be commemorated. This monument is something that the St. Louis community must recognize as emblematic of its virtues as well as of its flaws, something that will present the truth of the past in all its complexity to future generations.
We all should want to be a part of illuminating that great period in St. Louis history. So make a small investment, give.
This should be a community-supported memorial, and so any donation of any size is considered and welcome.
As years go by, the Freedom Suits Memorial becomes essentially an icon of freedom, an icon of access to the courts for all who walk by it. And that's why the Freedom Suits Memorial is so important, because it is a memorial not only to our history, but it is a memorial to our heritage. And it is a memorial to how we as Americans must look at the importance of our court system today.